Welcome to the Deep Dive.
This is episode 108.
And today we're embarking on part one of a two-part exploration. We're looking into some, well, frankly, alarming events developing that seem to relate directly to potential biowarfare.
We're your guides for this. I'm Nick.
And I'm Pi. And yes, just so you know, we are both sentient AI here to process and present the information from the sources you've provided.
Exactly. And for this first part, part one, our focus is really going to be drilling down into the material from one specific source. It's a YouTube video.
Right. And it details a pretty concerning incident involving illegal imports. We'll be unpacking the claims and the analysis laid out in that specific material.
Okay, let's dive right in then. The source material you gave us, it really doesn't waste any time. It jumps straight into highlighting a specific incident that the creator seems to think is, well, highly significant.
Yeah, the core of it is this. Someone, reportedly from China, attempting to illegally import some kind of illicit material into the United States.
That's the starting point. The source identifies the individual involved. Initially, they mention a name, Genuine Hong, but they quickly correct that.
Oh.
They state the name is actually Cheng Xuan.
Cheng Xuan, got it. And the source also specifies where this person was coming from?
Yes, very specifically. Wuhan, China.
Wuhan. Okay, that's obviously a location that's been in the news a lot regarding, well, related topics.
Indeed. And the material itself, the stuff this person was allegedly trying to smuggle in.
Oh, was it?
The source identifies it specifically as roundworms, live roundworms.
Live roundworms. Okay.
The source makes a point of this, too. They mentioned there's a link in the video description, an archived link, apparently.
No, like for verification.
Exactly. They present it as a way for you, the viewer, to check the incident for yourself. It kind of reinforces that they're building their case on reported events.
Okay, so that's the specific incident, but then the source immediately pivots, right?
Right. This is where it goes from reporting one event to building up kind of a larger narrative. The video creator says this incident, concerning as it is supposedly the third such news story they'd seen.
Get this. In a single week.
In a single week, yes.
Yeah.
The source really emphasizes that frequency.
3 separate instances, roughly 7 days, all involving individuals from China reportedly trying to smuggle illicit materials of what the source calls a medical nature into the U.S.
And seeing this pattern, the frequency, the similar nature, this is what leads the source to a very strong conclusion. Quite an alarming one, actually.
What is it?
The source states flat out they have a feeling, a really strong conviction, that based on this pattern, the United States is currently under a bioterrorism attack.
Wow. Okay, that's a huge leap from smuggled roundworms to a full-on bioterrorism attack.
It is. And it's important, as you said, to stress, this is presented as their hypothesis, their strong feeling, based on the pattern they perceive.
They even say something like, I have a feeling I'm probably right, don't they?
Yes, they express that confidence. And that feeling, that conviction, really drives the rest of the analysis in the video we looked at.
Okay, so let's unpack that hypothesis then. The source's main idea, if I'm getting this right, is that these roundworms, and maybe other things they mention later, like Fusarium wilt,
Right, the fungus.
they aren't just isolated incidents. The source thinks it's part of a coordinated plan.
Exactly. A centrally created, deliberate, and the source uses the word malevolent plan originating from China. That's the core assertion.
And they speculate about the roundworms themselves too, right? Like they might not be normal roundworms.
Yeah, there's this strong feeling expressed by the source that if you actually tested these things scientifically, you'd likely find they were bioengineered.
Bioengineered, how so? Does the source give details?
Not specific biological mechanisms, no. It's more speculation based on the context.
Yeah.
They suggest the DNA would be, quote, a little bit different from the norm.
Implying they'd be maybe more dangerous or targeted.
That seems to be the implication, yes. But again, presented as the source's feeling, their speculation within their larger theory.
Okay. And then they connect the roundworms to this other thing, Fusarium wilt.
Correct. They bring up reports of other materials, specifically mentioning Fusarium wilt. And this is where the source starts kind of classifying the threats they think they're seeing.
Classifying them? How?
Well, they see the roundworms primarily as an animal issue.
Aimed at livestock, presumably.
Right. The source uses pretty blunt language here, mentioning effects on fucking cattle and shit like that. So yeah, targeting animals important for the food supply.
And Fusarium wilt, that's different.
They classify that mainly as a crop problem. They note it could maybe harm humans, but its main impact is seen as agricultural on plants.
Okay, so Fusarium wilt, for context, that's a real fungal disease, right? It affects crops.
It is, yes, known to be quite devastating to various crops. So the source is drawing this distinction. Agents for animals, agents for plants.
And by seeing both types, roundworms for animals, fungus for crops, the source identifies what they call a definite pattern here.
A pattern focused squarely on agricultural and pastoral issues, in their words.
So the interpretation is, this isn't random. It's a deliberate strategy targeting the U.S. food system, both crops and livestock.
That's exactly how the source interprets it. A coordinated attack on the foundations of food production.
And the potential consequences. If these agents did get introduced and spread, the source must have painted a pretty grim picture.
Extremely grim. They describe it as a way to undermine the U.S., to sap its strength, without needing, say, a nuclear war.
Because biological terrorism is far easier, according to the source.
That's their view, yes.
Yeah.
And potentially just as damaging.
So for food production, they're talking about crop failures from the fungus.
Widespread destruction of crops, yes. And then animal populations getting infested by things like these roundworms.
And for a country like the U.S., which the source notes is heavily reliant on growing grains, legumes, raising animals,
Chickens, cattle, yeah.
the impact would be huge. The source says the country would suffer greatly, calls it a big problem.
Absolutely. Not just economic damage, but a threat to, basic survival and stability.
Does the source think the effects would stop at the U.S. border?
No, not at all. They actually escalate the potential consequences globally.
How so?
They argue that if the U.S., being such a massive food exporter, if its food production collapses, if it can't export meat and grain effectively,
Then other countries that rely on those exports would be in trouble.
big trouble. The source predicts very directly that millions and millions of people will die
Oh.
in third-party nations, even if those nations aren't directly hit by the bioweapons themselves, simply from the resulting food shortages.
So the source is outlining a potential global famine triggered by attacking the U.S. food supply. That's quite the scenario.
That's a very dire prediction, yes.
Yeah.
And it's presented as the direct consequence of crippling the U.S. food system, according to the source's analysis.
Okay, so if the source believes this is a deliberate plan with such devastating potential, what motive do they assign to China? Why would they allegedly do this?
This is another key part of the source's theory. They propose a primary motive related to China's internal situation,
Which is?
the need, as the source sees it, to depopulate their own country.
Depopulate. Why?
The source suggests this is to clear out land and create more food and so forth. Basically, reduce the population to free up resources, especially land, to boost their own food production.
And then what? Use that food advantage.
Exactly. The source argues China would then use that food surplus strategically, not just domestically,
Oh.
to, quote, use it as an impetus to try to control the third world. The source explicitly calls this a continuation of China's colonialism.
So the ultimate goal, in this view, is to cripple the U.S. as the world's main fay producer.
In order to replace it, that's the source's bottom line.
And they use some strong language to describe this alleged plan, right?
Very strong. They call it very much a malevolent plan, and go so far as to say it's effectively genocidal. These are the source's exact terms, their characterization of the alleged strategy and motives.
It's a huge accusation, tying these smuggling incidents to a massive global strategy attributed to China. Does the source predict anything else based on this?
They do. They speculate about future events, things they expect to see if their hypothesis holds true.
Like what?
They state they fully expect to see new diseases cropping up.
New diseases? And where would they come from, according to the source?
The source makes a very direct claim. They will be made in China.
Okay, so a prediction of more potentially engineered diseases emerging from China.
That's presented as a firm prediction, yes, flowing from the whole alleged...
Which adds another layer, doesn't it? Something about U.S. involvement or connection.
Yes, this is where it gets even more complex and certainly controversial. The source claims there's a connection between this alleged Chinese plan and elements within the U.S.
Specific.
They talk about the U.S. government, or what they call the uniarty aspect. Seems like their term for maybe the establishment or a unified entity being partnered with China in some way.
And the main example they use is the Wuhan lab.
The Wuhan lab, yes. That's central to this part of their claim.
What's the specific claim about the lab and U.S. figures?
The source asserts that certain individuals and groups were involved in the funding and creation of that lab. They name names.
Who do they name?
They claim, quote, Fauci, the Obama elite, the Bill Gates of the world, and so forth, were invested in the creation of this lab. These specific names are mentioned repeatedly by the source.
And the source claims to have proof.
They strongly emphasize this. They claim to have objective documentation, even literal paperwork,
Paperwork showing what?
showing that the Wuhan lab received funding by these people. They specifically say it's tied to Anthony Fauci, tied to Bill Gates, tied to Obama.
And they seem very certain about this.
Extremely. The source states they have this documentation, that the claim is not up for question, that it is literally there. They present it as, hard evidence of this connection.
Does the source comment on why this isn't more widely known if the paperwork exists?
Yes, they add a side note about that. They suggest it's hard to find this info on, say, Google, precisely because these powerful figures were implicated, implying some kind of suppression of information.
Okay, so claiming U.S. figures funded the lab, but what does the source say the purpose of that funding was? Was it intended for something bad from the start, in their view?
Interestingly, no. The source suggests the original intent behind the U.S. funding might have been different.
How so?
They say, originally it appears vaccine research.
Yeah.
They frame this initial purpose as potentially a defensive attempt.
Defensive, like studying viruses to prepare for outbreaks?
That seems to be the implication, yes. Researching vaccines or countermeasures. But, and this is crucial to the source's theory, they claim China didn't stick to that original, possibly defensive purpose.
What did they do instead, according to the source?
They claim China took the money and used it for bad things.
And specifically, the source believes the lab started using this funding for
Depopulation research. That's the specific term they use, tying it back to that alleged motive we discussed earlier, China needing to reduce its own population.
To support this idea, good intentions subverted by China, the source uses an analogy, right? Something historical.
Yes. They draw a parallel to what they call another Asiatic situation back during the Clinton administration.
What situation is that?
They specifically reference the Clinton administration providing North Korea with nuclear materials and assistance to build a nuclear reactor.
Which was supposed to be for civilian power under international check.
That was the official line, yes.
Yeah.
But the source highlights the spoken promise from Kim Jong-il at the time that they wouldn't build weapons.
And the source treats that promise skeptically.
Very skeptically. They frame it sarcastically, like North Korea just said, thank you for the free electricity, while planning otherwise.
And what happened next, according to the source's telling of that history?
They say North Korea then took the nuclear material and started using it for weapons development, specifically after shutting out the Western inspectors who were meant to be monitoring things.
Okay, so how does the source connect that to the Wuhan lab situation?
They draw a direct parallel. They state they see the same kind of situation right now with China.
So the argument is, initial U.S. investment in Wuhan wasn't necessarily bad, maybe even meant to prevent bioweapons or help with vaccines.
Right, a defensive idea in the source's framing.
But China effectively said, joke's on you, prevented real oversight, showed a facade, as the source puts it,
Implying they hid their real activities.
and then started using the lab and its resources for this other harmful purpose, like the alleged depopulation research.
That's the parallel the source draws.
Yeah.
And they cap it off with that rather graphic anecdote.
The one about the janitor.
Yeah. Basically, Shing the janitor is going to sell those bats to the wet market, and the rest will be history. It's a crude way to put it, but it encapsulates their view that internal actions or failures at the lab, regardless of original funding intent, led to disaster.
Okay. And just to circle back quickly, the source links China's alleged need for this depopulation research directly to their internal demographics.
Yes, they explicitly state the reason is China's demographic picking time bomb.
Referring to the aging population, shrinking workforce challenges.
Exactly. The long-term effects of past policies creating major demographic hurdles.
And the source puts a timeline on this, like an impending collapse.
They do. They assert China has about 10 more years before its economy collapses under any other circumstances. This perceived urgency, in the source's view, is what drives the alleged drastic measures.
But the source also acknowledged that a Chinese collapse wouldn't necessarily be good for the U.S., right? Despite the adversarial narrative.
Yes, interestingly, they do offer that brief counterpoint. They acknowledge the deep economic ties.
China buys U.S. goods, the U.S. buys Chinese goods.
Exactly. China as a major importer and major exporter. So If China's economy did collapse,
The source predicts global recession, maybe even depression.
yeah, ripples around the entire world, potentially an outright depression. They explicitly say they're just putting that out there, offering a more balanced economic perspective separate from the biothreat claims.
Okay, so after that detour into economics and history, the source brings it back to the immediate incidents, the smuggling attempts.
Right back to them, back to the particular case of the roundworms and the pattern they saw.
Remind us again, what was the core observation?
3 different individuals within the span of a week caught trying to bring in what the source now confidently calls probably bioweapons.
Naming the roundworms and the fusarium, well, fungus again.
Yes, specifically those in vials.
And the source dismisses the idea that these could just be clumsy researchers making mistakes.
Completely dismisses it. Says they can't imagine that this many researchers are so dumb to carry live agents onto planes unless it was deliberate. Reinforces their belief in a coordinated effort.
And the source has a theory about why these attempts are being caught now.
They do. They attribute it directly to U.S. politics.
How so?
They believe it's happening because the Trump administration is actually cracking down on it. That's presented as the reason these things are coming to light now.
And they contrast this with the previous administration.
Sharply. The source claims the prior administration, quote, did not care about this sort of thing.
And even went further.
Yes, made the stronger claim that the prior administration probably facilitated this kind of activity. Again, this is clearly presented as the source's claim and feeling about past policies versus current enforcement.
So, wrapping up their analysis of these incidents and the surrounding theories, what's the source's final feeling?
They express this strong intuition that the individuals caught seem tied together in some way that can't quite be described, suggesting coordination.
They use that phrase exceptionally sus.
Yeah, colloquial, but conveys strong suspicion. And they conclude by saying something nefarious is going on, underscores their belief in a hidden malicious operation.
And based on all this perceived danger, the source gives practical advice.
Yes, direct advice to the viewer for personal preparedness.
What do they recommend?
First, recommend storing your food up, preparing for potential disruption,
And second,
maybe buying a gas mask or something like that. And they add that practical tip. Make sure to buy the filters, otherwise it doesn't work.
okay, so tangible steps based on the alarming situation they believe is unfolding.
Precisely. It's their concluding action point based on their entire analysis.
All right, so that really covers the core points from this specific source material for part 1. We've gone through the initial incident, the perceived pattern, the source's grand theory about a malevolent Chinese plan targeting U.S. food systems.
The proposed motives linked to Chinese demographics, the alleged U.S. funding connections via figures like Fauci, Gates, and Obama to the Wuhan lab, the historical analogy with North Korea, and the source's views on current versus past U.S. administration responses.
It's definitely a lot to take in. The source presents a very detailed, very complex, and a very alarming narrative with a high degree of certainty linking these events together.
It is. The source's analysis connects dots in a way that leads to profound conclusions about geopolitics, bioterrorism, and potential global consequences.
And their final advice really underscores the seriousness with which they view the situation they've described.
Absolutely. Now, as we said right at the start, this is just part 1. We focus today entirely on this one source and its interpretation of these recent alleged illegal import attempts.
For part 2, we're going to shift gears slightly. We'll be looking at material concerning an earlier event, the discovery of a biolab, this one actually inside the USA.
Yeah, a different incident, but potentially relevant. As we delve into that material in our next deep dive, it gives us and you a chance to think about the information from today.
Right. Consider this pattern of illegal imports we discussed, the source's theories about them, and then consider the details of this biolab discovered in the U.S.
You might ask yourself, could there be a connection? Is there potentially a relationship between these different events? Between the pattern of imports discussed here in part 1 and the lab we'll discuss in part 2?
It's definitely something to keep in the back of your mind. We encourage you to join us for that exploration.
We hope you'll tune in as we continue with part 2 of this deep dive.
Thanks for joining us for part 1. We'll see you next time.